There is a difficult truth that most people spend years avoiding. The part of you destroying your life may not look destructive at all. May look responsible. Disciplined. Helpful. Reasonable. It may even look like the version of yourself you are most proud of. Human beings rarely become who they are by accident. Much of identity is formed quietly through adaptation. Over time, people learn which emotions receive acceptance and which create discomfort. Certain qualities are rewarded. Others are discouraged, ignored, or hidden. So a personality begins to form, not necessarily around truth, but around survival. A child learns that expressing anger leads to rejection and becomes endlessly agreeable. Another discovers that vulnerability invites disappointment and becomes emotionally distant. Someone learns that achievement earns attention and begins building worth through constant performance. At first, these adaptations appear useful. And often, they are. They protect. They create belonging. They reduce uncertainty. But the problem begins when what once served survival becomes mistaken for identity. Years pass. The person no longer says, "I learned to be this way." They begin saying, "This is who I am." And yet, something remains unsettled. Life becomes repetitive in strange ways. Relationships feel distant despite effort. Success feels empty. Choices feel safe but lifeless. The individual searches outside for explanations, bad timing, difficult people, lack of opportunity, without realizing that an invisible structure inside them may already be deciding what is possible, because the hidden self does not disappear. It waits behind identity. It influences attraction. It shapes fear. It determines what feels familiar and what feels impossible. And often, the greatest danger is not becoming someone destructive. It is becoming someone incomplete and calling it peace. The personality built for protection begins resisting anything that threatens its control. New opportunities feel uncomfortable. Honest emotions feel dangerous. Change feels unnecessary, not because growth is impossible, but because something inside believes survival still depends on remaining the same. This is why the real conflict is rarely between you and the world. It is between who you became and who you had to leave behind. Once a person begins to question the identity they built to survive, another realization slowly emerges. What was rejected never truly disappeared. The mind has a strange way of preserving what it cannot accept. People imagine that ignored emotions fade with time, that unwanted impulses weaken when denied, that painful truths lose power when avoided. But the hidden parts of the self rarely vanish. They adapt. And when they can no longer speak openly, they begin speaking indirectly. This is how the shadow begins to shape life, not as something traumatic or obvious, but as something subtle enough to be mistaken for personality. Unexpressed anger becomes quiet resentment. Fear becomes endless preparation. Insecurity becomes control. Shame becomes perfection. Loneliness becomes emotional independence. And because these patterns often appear useful, they remain unquestioned. A person may believe they are simply disciplined, while secretly being afraid of failure. Someone may believe they have high standards, while actually protecting themselves from intimacy. Another may call themselves calm, not realizing they have lost access to their own emotions. The shadow rarely appears as what it truly is. It wears acceptable masks. This is why people are often surprised by themselves. A small disagreement produces overwhelming anger. Simple rejection feels unbearable. Success creates anxiety instead of fulfillment. Relationships collapse for reasons that seem impossible to explain. These moments are rarely random. They are moments where hidden parts break through the surface. And often, the stronger a person identifies with one image of themselves, the more forcefully the opposite begins appearing in secret. The one who must always appear strong becomes terrified of weakness. The one who values goodness suppresses hostility until it emerges indirectly. The one who seeks total control becomes controlled by what they refuse to acknowledge. The shadow does not ask permission, it waits. And what waits long enough begins influencing choices, emotions, and perception from outside awareness. This is why self-destruction rarely announces itself. It arrives disguised as habits, as reactions, as familiar ways of living. And the moment you stop asking, "What is wrong with me?" and begin asking, "What part of me have I refused to see?" the hidden world begins to open. Once a person recognizes that hidden emotions and rejected parts continue influencing life, a difficult question begins to appear. If these forces remain active, where can they be seen? The answer is rarely found in isolated moments. It is found in repetition. Most people think of their problems as separate events, different relationships, different disappointments, different failures, different periods of life. But the unconscious does not think in events, it thinks in patterns. This is why life sometimes feels strangely repetitive, even when the circumstances change. The names are different, the places are different, the goals are different, yet the emotional result remains familiar. The same arguments return, the same feelings of rejection appear. The same opportunities are abandoned. The same emptiness follows success. And because the surface changes, people assume life is repeating itself. But often, something inside is. The mind returns to what remains unresolved, not because it enjoys suffering, but because it seeks completion. A person who never felt truly seen may unconsciously choose relationships where they continue proving their worth. Someone who learned that love must be earned may repeatedly overextend themselves, and later feel unseen. Another may sabotage moments of progress, because unfamiliar freedom feels more threatening than familiar struggle. These patterns can feel irrational. That is because they are rarely created by conscious decisions. They are built from emotional memory. The hidden mind prefers what is familiar over what is healthy. Even pain can become familiar. Even limitation can begin to feel safe. This is why people often confuse repetition with identity. They say, "This is just how I am. This always happens to me. This is my personality." Without noticing, they may be describing patterns, not truth. And patterns are different from identity. Patterns can be understood. Patterns can change. But first, they must be seen. This requires a different kind of attention. Not asking, "How do I escape this experience?" but "What is this experience trying to show me?" Because recurring problems are rarely punishment. They are messages. And sometimes the part of you secretly destroying your life is the part trying to protect you from becoming someone new. As recurring patterns begin to reveal themselves, another realization becomes impossible to ignore. Not every conflict inside you belongs only to you. Some struggles feel deeply personal, yet they appear with remarkable consistency across human life. The fear of rejection, the longing to belong, the need to feel significant, the resistance to change, the desire to remain safe, even when safety becomes a prison. People often treat these experiences as private failures, but many of them reflect something larger. Beneath personal history exists a deeper psychological layer made of inherited patterns of perception, emotion, and meaning forces that shape human behavior long before conscious identity fully forms. This deeper layer does not speak in direct language. It speaks through symbols. Through emotional themes. Through dreams. Through recurring attractions and fears that seem older than memory. This is why people across different lives often repeat the same internal traumas. One person sacrifices themselves endlessly for approval, another isolates to avoid disappointment. Someone else chases achievement, hoping success will finally create worth. The forms change, but the struggle remains familiar, because human beings are not only individuals, They are also expressions of deeper patterns moving through generations. And this realization changes the way destruction is understood, because the part secretly damaging your life is not always irrational. Sometimes it is ancient. The fear that keeps you small may once have protected connection. The need for control may have emerged from uncertainty. The resistance to becoming visible may carry old associations between exposure and pain. What appears destructive in the present may once have served survival. This is why awareness requires humility. When people judge themselves too quickly, they only deepen division. But when they become curious about the deeper origins of their reactions, something changes. They stop asking, "Why am I like this?" and begin asking, "What is this pattern trying to preserve?" That question opens a different relationship with the self, because inner conflict is rarely a battle between good and bad. More often, it is a negotiation between who you are becoming and what your mind still believes it must protect. And sometimes the life being quietly destroyed is being sacrificed in service of an old fear that no longer belongs to the present. Once a person begins to understand that hidden patterns were not created to destroy, but to protect, another difficult truth appears. Not all protection is healing. Some forms of protection slowly become prisons. This is why the part secretly damaging your life often feels impossible to let go of, because it does not appear as an enemy. It appears as safety. Avoidance protects against disappointment. Control protects against uncertainty. Emotional distance protects against rejection. Perfection protects against shame. Overthinking protects against mistakes. These strategies rarely begin as problems. They begin as intelligent responses. At some point in life, they served a purpose. They reduced pain, created stability, allowed survival. But the mind has a tendency to preserve old solutions long after the original danger has disappeared. And eventually, what once protected growth begins preventing it. A person avoids difficult conversations and calls it peace. They stop trusting others and call it independence. They refuse opportunities and call it realism. They disconnect from emotions and call it strength. The behavior appears reasonable. Yet underneath, life becomes smaller, not because possibilities disappear, but because the protective self quietly narrows what feels safe enough to live. This is the tragedy of unconscious self-protection. It rarely feels like fear. It feels like personality. And because it feels familiar, it becomes invisible. People defend the very patterns that exhaust them. They explain them, justify, then build identity around them, until eventually they cannot imagine themselves without them. But hidden defenses reveal themselves in one important way. They preserve safety while reducing aliveness. Life becomes predictable, controlled, manageable, and strangely distant. Transformation does not begin by attacking these defenses. It begins by understanding what they are trying to prevent. Because behind every rigid pattern is usually an old expectation. If I change, I will lose something. If I open up, I will be hurt. If I stop controlling, everything will collapse. But awareness creates another possibility. To recognize that protection and limitation are not always the same thing. And sometimes the part of you secretly destroying your life is simply the part that still believes the danger never ended. After recognizing the identity built for survival, seeing the shadow's hidden influence, uncovering repeating patterns, understanding deeper human conflicts, and meeting the protective parts of the mind, one final question remains. What now? Many people imagine that awareness itself creates change. They believe that once hidden patterns become visible, life will naturally reorganize itself. But awareness alone is not transformation. Seeing the prison is not the same as walking beyond it. This is where the deepest shift begins, because the goal was never to destroy the hidden parts of yourself. It was never to defeat fear. erase contradiction, or become a cleaner, more acceptable version of who you already are. The goal is to stop living as though one part of you deserves existence while the rest must remain in darkness. The mind becomes destructive when identity becomes too narrow. When only one version of the self is allowed to speak. The strong self, the rational self, the successful self, the good self. Everything else is pushed below awareness until eventually life becomes controlled by what was excluded. Integration begins when you no longer ask, how do I get rid of this part of me? But instead, what happens if I stop running from it? To stop running does not mean surrender. It means becoming conscious enough to remain present, to feel fear without obeying it, to experience anger without becoming it, to recognize insecurity without constructing an entire identity around hiding it, to allow contradiction without treating it as failure. Because human wholeness is not built from certainty, it is built from relationship. A relationship between the parts that seek safety and the parts that seek expansion. Between the self that learned to survive and the self that still wants to live. And something unexpected happens when this relationship begins. The patterns lose their invisibility. Old reactions become recognizable. Choices become less automatic. Life begins feeling less predetermined, not because the darkness disappeared, but because it no longer rules in secret. And in that moment, a quiet truth becomes impossible to ignore. The part of you that was secretly destroying your life was never trying to destroy you. It was trying to protect a version of you that no longer exists.